when we talk about child development, I don't know about you, but in my education, I got zero education about sensory processing, about sensory integration, about the foundational role of our sensory experiences, both literally and symbolically, in how we move through the world, right? And how we relate to our bodies and to other people. And so, I worked with a 4-year-old that had come out of foster care and just kept getting kicked out of classes and all these different spaces, had a pretty extreme history of neglect, as well as exposure to a lot of chaotic environments and other things. And she had no idea what to do with her little body. And so she would get really overwhelmed. And I think about things like she had no sense of personal space, which a lot of little kids don't. But at some point, you start to learn that, right? One of the ways that we learn that is you have to know where your body is in space and in relationship to other things. If we don't know that, you walk into things, you trip on things, you stand too close to people. And, for a kid that was really deprived in terms of like this early vestibular stimulation and input and proprioceptive input, these different things, she didn't get the input she needed for her sensory systems to learn about her body in space. And so she would get really, really close to other kids, and then it would aggravate things and they would escalate because other kids, their space would feel violated. But nobody looked at that and said, what's going on here? I'm so curious about how does she not attune to that? What is happening? Instead, it was, this is a bad kid. We don't even know if she can stay in this program or that program. These things keep happening. And it's heartbreaking, right? Because fast forward through that kid's life, what does that mean about some of these systems that she may end up involved with? And then also, obviously not by choice. And then also, what does it look like in terms of how people label her behaviors and what that tells her about herself? You're weird. You're a weirdo. You're awkward. You're inappropriate. One of my colleagues, John McCarthy, is a magnificent human and doing really cool work in Boston with youth. And he does a lot of work in trauma-informed physical education and sports spaces. During an after-school program, he had one of the young people in the program come in, and she had a history of some fighting. And she came in, and he said, I took one look at her, and I knew it was one of those days. But he said, her body is what told me. Like, sure, her fists were clenched. Her upper body was super tight. Her face was tense. And he said, I knew that if I didn't disrupt that it was going to happen again. But because John has really incredible trauma training, he knew that the typical intervention in that situation would be to go up and shut it down, maybe even shame it, what's wrong. Also very verbal engagement, right? Which is very higher functioning within our brain. He went up to this young person and without saying anything, he had on the way grabbed a couple of boxing gloves and puts his hands up. And as he's coaching the rest of the young people, he just puts his hands up and she just started moving. She just started punching back and forth, and he's not talking to her. He's addressing the other students. He's coaching, he's doing his thing, and she's just going. And then it gets more intense. It gets more intense. And then there's a point where she just stops and she puts her hands down. He doesn't say anything, and she walks away, and she was regulated. And I think about that as a really important story as someone who has the ability to attune to what we're being told by a young person's body about what they need. And he didn't even attempt to get the story out of her that day, but she was able to come back the next day and tell him what happened. And she had a teacher that day that had said something incredibly racist in her class. And she was so angry and so hurt and so upset and didn't have anywhere to take that anger. And so what would have happened, right? If someone like that weren't in the space, is the behaviors would have been labeled as problematic. She may have gotten suspended, expelled. You can see the chain of events that could take place when what her body was saying is like, something really terrible happened to me. Is anybody going to pay attention and listen? And the fact that she had someone paying attention and listening allowed her to process that. And then he was able to support her in doing something about what happened. And then she started to learn new ways to regulate. And I just think it's such a remarkable story about why this is so relevant to working with young people.